Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable Pak Slamet as our lecturer in this course, and also my beloved friends. I am Fatma Rahayu Nita. Today I would like to present the materials under the title Narrative Voices. Actually, what is narrative voices? Narrative is a basic human activity. We all tell stories to ourselves and to others. And the narrative is a form of communication. It is um, it is necessarily telling and showing the story by making the story real and alive. Within the narrative, it is also there is a narrator or the one who voices the story, or it is known as a narrative voice, whether it is real or implied that present the story to the reader. Within narrative, when we are talking about the narrative voice, it is closely related to the point of view, the method of narrations that determines the position or angle sufficient from which the story is told. In brief, the author um, the author is not same as the narrator because the author is the real person while the narrator is simply the voice to whom the the words of narratives are attributed. Let's continue to the next slide. Here is the table of contents. There are 4 points here. The first point is narrative voices in fictional discourse, and the second is narrator, and the third is Simpson's typology of narrators, and the last is third-person narrators. So I will explain one by one. Let's go to the first point, that is narrative voices in fictional discourse. The voice within fictional discourse must be distinguished from that of the author, just as the recipient of a message within the discourse is not identical with the reader. It is clearly stated that the voice within fictional discourse or the narrator is different from the author. It is just like as the recipient of a message is not identical with the reader. So the word I in the text cannot be identified as the author, and then the word you in the text cannot be identified as the reader. We should know the distinctions between the narrator and the author. That's why both argue that a novelist creates an implied author. The same author may seem to espouse different views in various novels, or may indeed create a narrator whose views are at odds with those of the author. Since the author and the narrator are different, so that the author may have a different views, different perspective from the narrators. While Genetti argues strongly against the concept of the implied author, on the ground that such a construct is not only unnecessary but impossible to sustain. He accepts that the implied author exists to the extent that it represents everything the reader can infer about the author from the text. So Janati preferred to define the implied author as the reader's interpretations about the author from the text. It can be helpful to assume a balancing construct of the implied reader, that is a reader who has the necessary linguistic and cultural knowledge to understand and appreciate the text. So if there is an implied author, there is also an implied reader to balance the construct, so that the reader, the implied reader, that is a reader who has necessary linguistic. It means that the reader should know and should understand the culture, the background knowledge, or the cultural knowledge when they read the text so that they can understand and appreciate the text. And also, when the reader know the background knowledge of the text, the reader may react to the text as they may have similar events in their real life. Let's continue to the second point. Uh, the next slide. Lee and Short over a widely accepted view of the structure of fictional discourse. The author or the writer and the reader lie outside the direct communicative flow established in the text. Yeah, since the writer and the reader are not involved in the text, so they are outside. They are like outside the direct communicative flow established in the text. Since the writer only create the story and the reader only read the text, so that yeah, it is they are outside the direct communicative flow established in the text. And the real author addresses us via the implied author, who in the present narratives may be identical to the narrator, within whose discourse we have a character's dialogue. Outside these frames are the real readers. So in the narrative, there is a real author who creates the story. Uh, the story is addressed through the implied author, or who in the present narrative may be identical to the narrator, and whether the narrator is also the characters of the story or not, and the one who read the story is considered as the real readers who are outside this frame. And Keenan argues that we also require a narrative, the recipient of the narrative. Some writers build narratives into their texts. Narrative may be a character within a narrative or the intended reader of a narrative text. So there is an implied author, there is an implied reader, and also we require a narrative, the recipient of the narrators, whether narrative may be a character of the narrative or just the intended reader of a narrative text. Let's continue to the second point, that is the narrator. As I have mentioned before, that the narrator is considered as also an implied author, that is the one who voices the story to the reader. And the same story told with different kinds of narrators can have very different effects. Alice trilogy is an example of this technique. The same story is told from the perspective of three main participants in the novels of The Clothes in the Wardrobe, The Skeleton in the Cupboard, and The Fly in the Ointment. And this is important that the narrative voice is not the author voice. The narrator is a character who the author controls. The narrator may also act as the character, or the narrator is not involved as the characters, but the author controls the narrator. The narrator often says things that an author believes to be untrue. That's why it is called fiction. And here there are types of narrators. The first type is first person or I as narrators, those who may or may not participate in the story they present. Those who are participants are also called as homodiegetic narrators. such as Conrad Marlowe. Conrad Marlowe is character in the story, but he also narrator of the story. So the role of the role of Marlowe in the novel's Heart of Darkness is considered as homodiegetic narrators. Yet, those who are essentially observers of the activities of others are so-called heterodiegetic narrators, such as Nick in Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So the main narrative voice belong to Nick, a character within the text who address an audience outside the text. Nick presents himself as the outsider, mostly observing the events of the main plot and the story of Gatsby without being instrumental in the action. So that Nick here has a role as the observers of the activities of the characters, and he do not act as the characters. So Nick in the Great Gatsby can be identified as the heterodiegetic narrators. And then second types of narrator is third person narrator. Those who play no part in the events and refer to the characters as he or she or they or by name. Actually, there are kinds of third person narrator. The first is third person limited point of view. It only tells little about other characters, and omniscient third omniscient narrator, that is the one who can tell everything about the characters. And let's go to the third point, that is Simpson's typology of narrators. Narrators who are participants in the story or homodiegetic are type A. Third person narrators are type B. Simpsons develops a typology of narrators based on the modality of the discourse. Positive type narrators, whether first or third person, are those who use evaluative adjectives and verba scientiendi, that is, words denoting feelings, touch, or perception appropriately. Narrator, and the second type is narrator whose discourse exhibit negative shading, exploit the epistemic model system with attention paid to perception. Terms of enrichment are also prominent. And the terms of enrichment here, like the use of word possible, seem, or other hedges that are used in the text. And the third is narratives with natural setting are those whose discourse is lacking in modality. It is characterized by assertions and the absence of evaluative terms. It is, in short, essentially a repertorial style. The examples are as follows. Alice in the Clothes in the Wardrobe, it has the first person narrator who is essentially of Simpson's a positive type. To her, religion was morality and appearance, and she kept it in the same compartment of her mind as her dinner napkins. The word to her represent the narrator's perception and also the thoughts of narrator. So that's why it is identified as Simpson's a positive type. And the second one is Marlowe in the Heart of Darkness is usually careful in this respect. Indeed, Marlowe appears to be an example of Simpson's type A with negative shading. His discourse is full of terms of estrangement. Many of his comments are hedged by perhaps, possibly, appear, seem, and similar terms qualifying his observations. Let's discuss first person narrators. Scholes and Kellogg consider that the motivation for the science were verisimilitude. I was there and I saw it. Uh, However, the first person narrators are limited to tell the other's characters. They only focus on their characters. I only tell the tell the characters I without telling the other characters. The example is in the governess in the turned off screw describing reception by housekeeper says, "Oh, she was glad I was there." This sentence can be identified as the first person narrators, but the word I was there, and oh, she was glad I was there. The speculation is exists. Um, it is like the limitation of first person narratives that the narrator should not make assertions about the motives, thoughts, or intention of other characters in the fiction, though speculation is possible, so that the governors only mention she was glad I was there. Yeah, it is the voice of the first person narrative. And then first person narratives are closer to the real world, and it's known that third person narratives with their potential for omniscience. As I have mentioned before, that third person narratives can tell everything about other characters, but first person narratives cannot um, cannot make assertions about the thoughts of other characters. Let's continue to the next slide. Narrative instance. Um, a particular feature of first-person narrative is identified by Brooke Cross in 1981 that is reference to the time of writing in her study of the turned of screw, and she called this narrative instance. Actually, narrative instance is closely related to the time of writing. And to give the example of simple form of the type is I remember, that marks the distinction between the time of writing and the time when the events narrated purport to have taken place. After 2 years, I remember the rest of that day. The further explanation is here. Narrative instance has two effects. In addition to marking a temporal gaps, it implies that the author is aware of his or her role and suggests awareness of an audience. If the time of writing is very close to the time narrated, the narrative instance may be absent or unremarkable. So, if the time of writing is very close to the time narrated, like 1 day ago or 2 days ago, so that the narrative instance are not exist, or it may absence or unremarkable. The examples of narrative instance is in Conrad Hearts of Darkness, um, to refer that Marlowe referred his role as a narrator as well as participant in his story. I did not see the man in the name any more than you do. Do you see him? Do you see the story? Do you see anything? It seems to me I'm trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation. In this example, Marlowe tried to present himself as a reflective man who invite a similarly thoughtful reaction from his audience. And also, Marlowe questions 3 times. Do you see him? Do you see the story? Do you see anything? So that it may give the awareness of the audience that questions should be answered. And the narrator are trying to represent himself as the reflective man. So it is included in the form of narrative instance since it implicitly encodes the difference between the story time and time of preparations. Let's continue to the fourth point, that is third person narrators. Third person narratives are Simpsons type B. This type of narrator is disembodied voice. It can inform the reader of events anywhere and not always exploited to enter into the minds of characters in the fictions. So that in the third person narrators, the narrators can tell everything about the characters and they can also enter into the minds of characters in the fictions. It is different from the first person narrators that cannot enter into the minds of other characters. And the ground rules for the interpretation of the so-called omniscient narrator, or Simpson's type B positive, require that we believe that within the realms of fictional discourse, what they present is true. So, omniscient narrators, the narrators can tell everything about the characters in the story. And here is the example of P positive narrative from Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. And it can be identified as the narrator since the use of the name of the characters, that is Mr. Bennet, and also the narrator seems to know everything about the characteristic of Mr. Bennet, like the word uh, Mr. Bennet was so odd, a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, and so on and so forth. Since the narrator can report the thoughts of characters, this type of narration is, in some respect, the richest and most complex, with the potential for irony arising from the interplay of the perception of characters and narrator. And the next is Simpson's type B neutral. Is an interpersonal style of narrations, largely devoid of modality of the analysis of the thoughts and feeling of characters. The example is from Hemingway's In Our Time. The word is, they shot the 6 cabinet ministers at 6:30 in the morning against the wall of a hospital. The reader is cast off balance by the use of definite article. We wonder which 6 cabinet ministers. This is followed by the indefinite articles for a hospital. A hospital. This is essentially uncooperative because the use of definite article the in the 6 cabinet minister and also the use of indefinite article for a hospital. And the last point is type B negative narratives are unsettling because the narrator seems uncertain about how to interpret events. The use of terms of estrangement as if is common. She gathers up the handles of her bags, picks up her book and looks at him and through him as if he were already a distant memory and lives without a goodbye. Indeed, as if she had said goodbye and goodbye to him long ago. So the word as if is um, is involved in the terms of arrangement. So that type B, it is the example of type B negative narrative. So now we come to the conclusions. Hmm. So that I have explained starting from the narrative phases in fictional discourse and the narrator and narrative instance, and also the first person narrator, the third person narrator, and so on and so forth. And it is an aspect of a discourse, which means that it's part of the analysis that examines how narrative is told. So the narrator is not the same as, so that we can conclude that the narrator is not the same as the author of the book, which contains of narrative. The author is a real person. The narrator is simply the voice to whom the words of narrator are attributed. And then, yeah, so that author and actual reader are outside of the narrative text, and the narrator, the ones who present the story or to give the voice, to give the voice to the reader, while the author is the one who creates the story, and the narrator, whether it is a character in the story or not, and the characters is divided into two: the character who speaks and the character who listens. And within the narrative text, it is there is within narrative text there is a message, and also there is a narrative, the recipient of the message. Yeah, that's all about my presentations. Here is the reference that I used to create the PPT. For the main source is from Black 2005, Pragmatic Stylistic, Edinburgh University Press, and the rest are the supporting reference, just to support the main reference. Thank you very much for your attentions, and the last I say, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.